Afternoon, fellow students, faculty, and staff. My name is Michelle Sayed, and I am a master's here at Georgetown and a board member of the Latin American Policy Association. As you may know, LAPA is an organization that strives to create spaces like this, where students can have thoughtful conversations about Latin America, engage with policy and decision makers, and enrich their education as they become future leaders. As a Colombian, it is a true honor to see so many faces interested in learning about my country and its history beyond some TV shows. For some, like me, growing up in Colombia meant having the country's conflict as a constant backdrop, living with a constant worry and a constant fear. For millions more, the conflict has been less forgiving. It's been up close, it's been raw, it's been violent. It has torn many families and communities. In 2016, Colombians everywhere saw a glimmer of hope when the government signed the peace accords with the FARC guerrilla. I would be lying to you that it was a moment of just pure joy. As some Colombians here in the room can tell you, it was a little bit more complicated than that. Yes, it came with joy, it came with hope, but also some fear and some uncertainty, and even anger. Today, we get the unique opportunity to hear from President Juan Manuel Santos, to listen to his account on one of the region's most historic moments, and to reflect upon where we are 5 years later. Many of us come to Georgetown because of its core values: service and community engagement, free exchange of ideas, and building bridges for those in need. Today, all those values converge in this event. And I ask every one of you to ponder on the privilege and the responsibility that it means to be a Georgetown student. Before I pass to Father Carnes, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies, who will introduce our speakers, I want to thank the School of Foreign Service and their event team for making this possible, the Center for Latin American Studies, the Georgetown Institute of the Americas, especially to Alma Caballero, and all of LAPA, the LAPA board, our volunteers, to Pedro Casasalatriste, because you work tirelessly, we're able to hold events like this. Without you, this would not have been possible. Father Carnes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michelle, and good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to Georgetown University. As Michelle said, my name is Matthew Carnes, and I have the privilege of serving as director of our Center for Latin American Studies here at Georgetown. Now, with our over 200-year legacy of academic excellence, our Washington, D.C. location, our Jesuit values, our regional networks, Georgetown is proud to be one of the leading U.S. universities engaged in Latin America. Faculty and students across our research and teaching programs address the critical challenges facing the Americas, including economic growth and innovation, governance and the rule of law, social and cultural cohesion, environmental sustainability. Georgetown University has deep historical ties to Latin America as well, reaching all the way back to our founding in 1789, and before that, the time of the Jesuits already running universities in Latin America for more than a century and a half before that. Today, Georgetown is part of a hemispheric network of over 58 Jesuit colleges and universities spanning the globe. Now, Georgetown's current engagement with Latin America stretches across our schools on the main campus, the Medical Center, and the Law Center. Our main hubs of research, teaching, and outreach include the Center for Latin American Studies, housed in the Walsh School of Foreign Service, the Latin American Leadership Program, housed here in the McDonough School of Business, the McCourt School of Public Policy, the Center for the Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas at our Law Center, and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. We're especially proud to have recently founded the Georgetown Americas Institute, which harnesses the many strengths of the university to pursue ever greater relationships with and impact in the region. This event is one of the founding efforts in the Georgetown Americas Institute, and it could not be more timely as we look at the Colombian peace agreement 5 years later, this conversation with President Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia. For many years, we at Georgetown have been deeply involved in the peace process in Colombia. My predecessor as director at the Center for Latin American Studies, Professor Mark Chernick, lived and followed the peace process with a passion and a dedication that marked every breath. And his impact continues to live on here at Georgetown and in Colombia. I'm also reminded of Father Francisco de Rue, who's heading the Comisión de la Verdad in this moment, exploring, trying to find the truth of the history of violence in Colombia as it heals its wounds. It's in their spirit that we convene today to assess where the peace agreement stands, where its implementation stands. As I'm sure all of you who have joined us today know, the Colombian peace process constitutes one of the most important and one of the most audacious efforts to not only address a need for peace, but also to reorient and reestablish the Colombian society on a new foundation of peace, of security, of truth, of dignity and inclusion. And it's a daunting and inspiring task, as Michelle said so well. Many have questioned if it even can be accomplished. And now, 5 years out from the signing of that agreement on the 24th of November 2016, we have a chance to assess the program and where it stands. No one knows that process better than our main guest today, President Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia. He's a Nobel laureate, a tireless champion of peace, justice, and reconciliation in his country's decades-long armed civil conflict, and he has an unequaled perspective on where the peace agreement stands today. He served his country as president from 2010 to 2018. In 2016, he was the sole recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for what the Nobel Committee described as his resolute efforts to bring Colombia's more than 50-year-long civil war to an end. In recognition of his work on Colombia's peace accords, he was also awarded the Lamp of Assisi by the Catholic Church and the Tipperary International Peace Award. Before his election as president, President Santos served as vice president, as Minister of Foreign Trade, as Minister of Finance, and as Minister of Defense. Today, President Santos will be in conversation with Alejandro Werner, who will join the Georgetown Americas Institute as its founding director in January. Most recently, Alejandro Werner was director of the Western Hemisphere Department of the International Monetary Fund. He served as Undersecretary of Finance and Public Credit of Mexico from 2006 to 2010. He was professor of economics at the Instituto de Empresa in Madrid from 2010 to 2011, and as head of corporate and investment banking at BBVA Bancomer from 2011 until 2012. So now let me turn things over to them. Welcome, President Santos. Welcome, Dr. Werner.
Well, let me also welcome you. Bienvenido, Presidente, at Georgetown University. I mean, it's a pleasure to have you here. It's a pleasure to commemorate these 5 years after such a significant achievement of yours with the peace agreement in Colombia, after more than half a century of violent struggle in your country. I think at the time it was the longest lasting conflict in the world, and you had the courage and you had the vision to end it. And now we are here, 5 years after that very important moment, reflecting on what that meant for Colombia, what it will mean for Colombia and for the region as a whole. As Matthew said, and Michelle, on November 24th of 2016, this agreement was signed, and I think it was approved by Congress 5 days after that. So we will have a conversation with President Santos, and then we'll turn it to you for your questions, and we will finalize with some recognition that the students want to give President Santos today. So let me start the conversation by going back and maybe quoting you when you said, "It is far more difficult to make peace than it is to make war. I know, I have done both." As many of you know, and Matthew said, the President was Minister of Defense in 2006 to 2009, and he fought the guerrillas head on. Then, in his inauguration speech in 2010, he told the Colombian population that he was going to look for a peace agreement with the FARC. I think that generated a lot of discomfort among maybe many of your voters. But it took courage, it took vision, and it took leadership to do that. So I think, the first question maybe is to go back before the peace agreement. What was your historical thinking about how to finalize the conflict in Colombia? How your thinking changed throughout the different stages of your career? What were the main turning points? And maybe also, if you can tell us the story on how you were able to build a very strong coalition, maybe with the hardest group to convince, that were the families of the victims.
Well, thank you, Alejandro, and thank you all for this invitation and this opportunity. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here. This university is a very famous university, so it's always a great pleasure to be here. I will go back to the origins of what helped me achieve what we achieved. And I go back to when I was in the Navy. I was a recruit in the Colombian Navy, and an officer said, Santos, go and learn how to sail. And he gave me a small sailboat. I had no idea what to do. I said, I'll teach you a lesson. If you want to be a good sailor, you have to have a port of destiny. You need to know where you want to go. And if you know where you want to go, you can use the winds to get there, even if the winds are against you. That is a very important lesson for any person, for any business, for any government. You need to know where you want to go and have an objective. And I had that in the back of my mind. Many years later, I was Minister of Trade, first foreign trade minister. I had to open the Colombian economy, and I was elected president, chair of the UNCTAD, the 8th conference of the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development. And when that finished, I had to go to South Africa to give the chair to Nelson Mandela. And I arrived in Johannesburg, and I was in the hotel. I turned on the television, and I saw a real surreal program, live television, and the victims and the perpetrators of the war in South Africa meeting for the first time on television, in real time. Some of them embraced, others hit each other, some screamed at each other. And I said, what is happening here? That afternoon, I had programmed a 15-minute visit to Mandela to give him the chair of the UNCTAD. And I asked him, what is it that I saw this morning here in your television? And he sat down to explain to me the whole South African peace process. And this 15 minutes was prolonged to almost 5 hours. And it was a very, very rich conversation. And at the very end, he said to me, South Africa and Colombia, they have many similarities. But you have to make peace in your country if you want your country to take off. And I heard those words. I've been a journalist a big part of my time, of my work, and I was seeing how the war was sort of eating up our moral fiber. As a journalist, I remember that if there was a massacre that was less than 10 people, it wouldn't be on the front pages. So we were losing our capacity to feel compassion. So I said, we have to try to achieve peace. All my predecessors had tried, but they had failed. So I started to study the different peace processes around the world and the efforts that all my predecessors had made and failed. Why? Why did they fail? What are the necessary conditions to have a successful peace process? I discovered 3 conditions. One, that you would have to have the military balance of power in your favor, because if the guerrillas thought that they would go to win through violence, they would never negotiate in good faith. A second condition is that the commanders of the guerrillas personally, they should be convinced that it's in their favor to negotiate peace instead of to continue the war. And a third condition is common to any asymmetrical war, Colombia or Afghanistan or Somalia, wherever. You need the support of the region, of your neighbors, in order to have a successful peace process. So, discovering those conditions, I had the opportunity, because I founded a new party in Colombia that was very successful. So I was appointed Minister of Defense. And there I said I could maybe fulfill the first 2 conditions. And I went to a friend of mine at that time, was Prime Minister of Great Britain, Tony Blair, and I asked him, please help me in what you are the best. And he said, and what is it that we are the best? I said, intelligence. He helped me, he got the phone. There was a marvelous person called Sir John Scarlett. He was the head of MI6. I say he was the boss of James Bond. You know? But he knew about the Colombian intelligence and said, you have to change it completely. And we made the changes. And we started to have a very successful process against the FARC and against, for the first time in 40 years, against the leaders. The leaders, what they call the secretariat, like the board of directors, had never been touched. And they were even very, what's the word, soberbios, very, proud. Not proud, but yeah. They really thought that they could go anywhere in the country and nobody would touch them. Well, we started touching them. And we reorganized the intelligence and we started giving very severe blows. And I had started, me and many other people, a process of improving our armed forces since I was Minister of Finance. That was some years before. So we were able to fulfill the 2 conditions. And when I became president, at that time, we had no diplomatic relations with Venezuela, with Chavez, with Ecuador, with Korea, very bad relations with Lula in Brazil, and with the region in general. And so I said, I have to change this. And I was one of the worst adversaries of Chavez. He even told my predecessor, Uribe, he said, if Santos is going to be present, there's going to be war between Colombia and Venezuela. Well, we managed to change that. And we made peace with Chavez, peace with Correa, peace with Lula, and the region. And they started helping the peace process. And that's how we created the conditions to start the negotiation. And at a certain moment in time, I thought of bringing some international advisors. They were very, very important to help me go through the process. I brought in the chief negotiator of the British government in the Northern Ireland negotiation with the IRA. Jonathan Powell is his name. I brought in a Salvadorian commander, Joaquin Villalobos, who was the chief negotiator of the Salvadoran guerrillas in the Salvadoran peace process. I brought in the former Minister of Foreign Relations of Israel, who was the architect of the Camp David Agreement, called Shlomo Ben-Ami, a professor of negotiations at Harvard called Bill Uri. And they were like my think tank advisors, and they started saying, well, you should do this, you should do that. And Shlomo Ben-Ami said, you are going to suffer something which is very common in any peace process, especially because you were elected president because you were a war hero. And that is true. When I finished my Ministry of Defense, I was the most popular politician in Colombia because I had given the biggest blows to the FARC. So I was elected with a very high percentage, at that time the highest amount of votes in the Colombian history, and I was a war hero. So, as was mentioned here, when I announced that I was going to sit down and negotiate peace, I was warned by Shlomo Ben-Ami that I would be called a traitor, and exactly that happened. You're a traitor. We didn't vote for you to negotiate with these terrorists, and it was very costly politically. But Shlomo and many people said, it's the only way that you will achieve peace in Colombia. A military victory is impossible in the geography that Colombia has, and a military victory will not bring peace. It has to be negotiated. So we started the negotiation. It was a secret phase of 2 years. We negotiated the agenda, and then the public phase, which was developed in Cuba, in La Habana. In the meantime, we continued the war. That is a very key aspect here. The FARC wanted a ceasefire. But since we had achieved a military balance of power in our favor, I need to have a carrot, but also a stick. So I said, no ceasefire until we have an agreement. And there's a negotiating sort of strategy that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So when we have everything agreed, we will stop the war. In the meantime, and I had told them, I told the FARC secretariat, we continue the war, and with these words, these are the exact words that I used, you can kill me, I am the president, and that is an act of war. I mean, that's part of the rules of the game. In order to warn them that the war would continue, not to think that because we were talking, I was going to be more benevolent. Well, some months later, I remember I was in the meeting with the board of trustees of Nature Conservancy. There's somebody that you probably know. He was the former Secretary of the Treasury, Paul
Paulson.
Hank
Yeah,
Paulson. He was there, I remember. And suddenly I received a call from one of my military commanders, said, we have located the #1 of the FARC, the leader of the FARC. We want to hear your instructions. My God. And that's a very difficult decision between risking the peace process by going after him, because I knew that he was not going to be taken prisoner. I was dreaming of having like Abigail Guzman in Peru with pajamas and in a truck, have the FARC leader there, but I knew that he would not be taken prisoner. He would rather die, and I authorized the operation, and he was killed. But the FARC commanders decided to continue the war, to continue the negotiations, and they said, he warned us, and this is part of the rules of the game. And that is an irony, but became a very important factor in building trust and respecting each other. You know, this guy delivers, and I also said, these people deliver. And so there was a process of creating trust. And we negotiated for about 4 more years, 2 years secretly, 4 more years, and we finally signed the peace process. And why do I say that it's more difficult to make peace than to make war? There are 2 completely different types of leadership. Leadership making war, Minister of Defense, you give orders. You rally the forces around you, and you go against your enemies or adversaries. And that is a relatively easy type of leadership, vertical leadership. Making peace requires a different type of leadership, more horizontal. Instead of giving orders, you have to be very persuasive. And you have to persuade a mother whose son or whose daughter has been raped and killed to accept that the perpetrators will receive some kind of legal benefits. And that is much more difficult. And in every peace process, there are 2 phases. One is peacemaking. What is peacemaking? You negotiate, you apply what they call DDR, it's demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. And that is peacemaking. But then you have the second phase, which is peace building. That is much more difficult because that takes a lot of time. I say it's like building a cathedral, brick by brick. You have to heal the wounds of 50 years of war, and that is very difficult. We are in this process right now. The Truth Commission is part of that process. And this agreement was very sui generis in many ways. It's the first agreement ever to be negotiated under the umbrella of the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute is an international treaty that, among other things, created, for example, the International Criminal Court. But it was created in order to facilitate peace processes by applying what they call transitional justice, which is a different kind of justice than the one we are accustomed to. It's not a punitive justice, it's what they call restorative justice. So you don't send the people who have committed crimes against humanity and war crimes to a jail. You judge them, you condemn them, and you send them to an alternative punishment, which is repairing the victims. And that's exactly what we're doing now. And in the process, and this is the first time that this has been done, we put the victims and their rights in the center of the negotiation. The rights that are stipulated in the Rome Statute. Which are those rights for the victims? The rights of the victims to justice, to reparations, to the truth. The truth is very important, and to non-repetition. Those 4 rights were the sort of the core of the negotiation. And we established a special tribunal. This is also the first time ever that 2 parts in an armed conflict get together, create a special tribunal, and submit to it. This has never happened. Other peace processes since the Second World War are peace processes that where the tribunal, for example, in Nuremberg or in Tokyo, was imposed by the winner of the war to the people who lost. Or other tribunals, like in Rwanda or in Yugoslavia, were imposed by the United Nations. This is the first time that no imposition, it was a collaborative work of the 2 parts creating a special tribunal. And this tribunal is right now working very hard. They have advanced tremendously, and I hope that by the beginning of next year they start ruling, they start deciding the sanctions of, for example, they have 7 macro cases. The leaders of the FARC have been accused of kidnapping, of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and will be judged and condemned. But they have to be condemned if they tell the truth and they recognize their responsibility. And this is not easy, but they have done it. Already, many of the FARC leaders have recognized that they were responsible for crimes against humanity, for war crimes. They have said, I'm sorry to the victims, and we're in that process. It's a difficult process, but it's a necessary process, because that is the way to heal the wounds, and it takes time. And many times, for example, the Peace Commission, the Father Derues that I understand was here some weeks ago, to hear the truth, sometimes it's very hard. It's very painful, but it is necessary. And we are right now in that process of hearing the truth, of trying to recopilate the truth of 50 years of war, which is almost an impossible work, but you have to be selective. And we are in the process of judging not only the FARC, but also the people from the military who committed crimes against humanity and war crimes, because it's also justice for both parties. It has been difficult also because many people criticize that the military who have committed crimes should be judged by the same standards as the guerrillas. They're not being judged by the same standards, but they're being judged for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And that is also a necessary condition to continue. So 5 years later, we signed the peace agreement. We fulfilled the peacemaking phase very fast and very successfully, almost in record time. They gave up the arms. They gave it to the United Nations, and that part of the peace agreement was very well implemented. And then we started the peace building process, which we are right now. What would be sort of a summary of where we are? We have to remember that this peace agreement was a peace agreement signed with the FARC, and the FARC no longer exists. There was the most powerful and oldest guerrilla movement in the Western Hemisphere, and the FARC ceased to exist. They are now a political party called Comunes. More than 95% of the guerrillas that turned in their weapons and got into the process are right now in the process and accounted for. This is a much higher percentage than any other process in the recent history of the world. Usually it's between 85, 87%. Here is more than 95% who are still 5 years later in the process. The agreement was also not only to disarm the FARC, it was to change the structural conditions of the problems that had created the conflict and the problems of Colombia. Like, for example, Colombia is one of the countries with the worst, and you know that, Alejandro, better than I do, worst distribution of land in the whole planet. We have a terrible distribution of land. Well, the first point of the agreement was a rule reform to address that. Much of the inequality and the poverty in Colombia is in the rural areas, and that was one of the points. We had the other aspect, which was very, very important, was the war against the drug traffickers and the war against drugs. Colombia has been the country that has suffered the most in this world war against drugs that was declared 50 years ago, and that has been a complete failure. Today we are worse off than what we were 50 years ago when President Nixon declared the war here and the United Nations declared the war on drugs. We are worse off today. But we wanted to address the problem of the production of coca. And so we agreed with the FARC that controlled the areas where the coca was produced to start a voluntary substitution of illegal crops for legal crops. And that started to be implemented with a very high degree of success. One of the problems that Colombia has had for many, many years is that you go, you eradicate, or before you sprayed the coca plantations, and 6 months later, they simply replanted. So it's like a vicious circle. Well, when you give the peasants an alternative, they will not replant. They don't like the coca business if they have an alternative. And so we started to do that, and the percentage of replanting is between 40 and 60% traditionally. Well, with this process, it was less than 1%, verified by the UN. Unfortunately, for many factors, some of them quite absurd, like, for example, the FARC were classified as terrorists by the US government. The US government is the most interested in the disappearance of the coca plantations. This program needed funding, but they couldn't finance the peasants because they were still considered terrorists. So these are the type of contradictions that we have to encounter, but we have to continue. And I would say that the agreement, the implementation agreement is going in a normal way with the usual problems that a peace agreement has, especially a peace agreement that is considered the most ambitious and the most profound ever negotiated. We gave ourselves 15 years to implement the agreement. We are celebrating the 5th year, which in practice is the 3rd year, because we spent 2 years in a very Latin American characteristic of discussing legally, and this is this article, this procedure, but really the implementation started 3 years ago. We have some objective verificators that tell us how much we have done and how much we still have to do. One of them is an institute called the Kroc Institute of the University of Notre Dame. They are probably the ones who know better how to monitor the implementation of peace agreements. They've done this for many, many years. They, every 3 months, they give a report, and they say that we have fulfilled more or less 30% of the more than 500 points included in the agreement. So, simply by a mathematical formula, 30%, 5 years out of 15, we're okay. We're not okay in some of the points of the agreement that have not even started, like, for example, the rule reform is way behind. The drug aspect, we advanced and we came back. The political reforms, some of them have been made, others we have to do them in the future. But overall, I think that the agreement is going in the correct direction and with problems, but it's advancing. Probably the most difficult problem that we have now is that the areas that were controlled by the FARC, we failed when I say the Colombia, I don't want to start criticizing my successor, but failed to control the territory. And since the drug business is not going to end until you, and believe me, we can discuss this a bit later, until we legalize the drug traffic. I know this is a bit shocking, but I'll do a parenthesis. I had the opportunity, because I was Minister of Defense, of working with the US government by the book, and I ended up being the person who eradicated more hectares of coca in the history of the world. I ended up being the person who sprayed more hectares of coca in the history of the world. And as president, I was the person who extradited more drug traffickers to the US in the history of the world. 1,423 narco traffickers were extradited during my presidency. So I from being a very hardliner, applying the punitive approach, I am today convinced that the only long-term solution is to regulate the market. As long as the word prohibition is there, you will have the mafias, and you will have the violence, and this is a vicious circle. I use to illustrate this point an anecdote of a recent biography of Winston Churchill by a historian called Andrew Roberts. He describes that Churchill, during Prohibition, in the 20s, went through Canada to California. And Churchill used to drink a lot. And he asked for a whiskey. And they said, "Oh, no, no, Mr. Churchill, this is prohibited here in the United States." And he answered with that sense of humor that he had, "What a strange country this is," referring to the United States. These fabulous profits that are made by the sale of liquor, you give them here to the mafias. In my country, in the UK, we give them to the Treasury. That, in a way, encapsulates the problem of the war on drugs. I stop this parenthesis, and I will continue and finish with this statement. The peace process has gone through a very difficult moment because politically it has been stigmatized, it has been criticized, and many people have tried to derail it. They have not been able to derail it. Some have been able, have tried to stop it. The train continues, and I am happy to say that many of the people that tried to derail it are now enthusiastic about the implementation of the agreement, including a former student of Georgetown called Ivan Duque. He now is enthusiastic about implementing the peace agreement, which makes me a very, very happy Colombian. I hope that we can continue to work together, because in the agreement, many of the problems that Colombia has today, in the agreement, you have the solution. The problem is that many people, the majority of the people, have not read the agreement. It's more than 300 pages. And you find the solution to many of the problems. So what I hope is that whoever wins the presidency next year, and I'm not going to get into that politics, will be committed to implement the agreement. And I am happy that even the ones that were against the agreement are now, apparently, in favor of implementing the agreement. This is a good news for Colombia, good news for the agreement.
This is great. So let's do another agreement that we will invite you back to talk about drugs, what's the future of the policies against drugs, and how to talk about legalization in the future. And now we can open it up for questions for the students. And also recognizing in your last words that in the peace treaty, you also had significant elements to guide the new economy that will develop after the peace agreement, opening up new areas for new activities in the Colombian economy. Also, I mean, you had several things to pacify society and for society to live in peace. And by living in peace, to live in a completely different way that will also, I think, change the politics of Colombia in a way that will make the country much more democratic, much more open and inclusive. So with that, we can take some questions from students.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, I think there's some mics. Yeah, so we have one question here at the front. So it's, yeah. No.
Hi, President Santos. My name is Dea. Thank you for being here today and truly breathing life into all the lectures and textbook readings that we have of Colombia. You truly put things into context, into something we can see and understand. My first question, as being a student of diplomacy in the master's program at MSFS, is in relation to the tradecraft behind creating a successful negotiation team that was present in the FARC negotiation process. I would like for you to expand on what made you look for specific people to be part of your team building process that made that process successful, and what we can learn from that peace building process to apply to other ones in the future in other post-conflict societies. Thank you.
Thank you. And that question allows me to answer one of the questions that you made at the beginning of how was I able to create the coalition, political coalition, to be able to implement the peace process. When I was elected president in 2010, I remembered a book about Abraham Lincoln. Why did Abraham Lincoln was able to pass this constitutional amendment to do away with slavery? He brought into the government his rivals. The book is called The Team of Rivals. And so I said, I'm going to do the same thing as Abraham Lincoln. So I asked my rivals in the election, the ones that had competed against me, to come into the government, and I sort of adopted the main issues of each one that I thought was, because many times the candidates, they all want to lower poverty, they all want to lower inflation, they all want so it's come here and I'll implement, and you will name the ministers that you want to implement your policies. So that gave me almost 85% of Congress, and that was extremely important. Now, how did I build a team of negotiators? That is a very important question. One of the conditions that or the factors that I discovered that my predecessors had, the mistakes that they had committed, was not to take into account the military in the negotiations, because they all thought that the military would automatically be against the peace process. They would lose power, they would lose money, the budget. And I said, no, I was in the military. I remember some words of General MacArthur, who said, the soldiers are the ones who want peace because they are the ones who risk their lives. And so I brought in the two most prestigious generals, one of the police and one of the army, as negotiators. I brought in the private sector, the president of what they call the ANDI, the industrial
Lobby.
The industrial group of the group that unites all the industry in Colombia. I brought him as a negotiator. And I brought a very prestigious former vice president. So the group that I created was a heterogeneous group that represented the different factors of the country and the different factors that had usually been against a peace process. We brought in, there are two aspects which were important. The gender aspect, women in the negotiating team and the indigenous communities and the ethnic aspect also. That's why the agreement has a chapter, an ethnic chapter that has a very progressive proposals with the indigenous communities and the Afro-Colombian communities, which, if implemented, would solve many of the problems we have right now. The only thing they want, and part of the protests that you see in Colombia right now by the indigenous communities are because they're not implementing what is in the agreement for them. And today, the best thing that Colombia can do to contribute in this existential challenge to stop climate change is to empower the indigenous communities to protect the most valuable richness that we have, which is our biodiversity, our Amazon, and what we have, our water fountains. We have the so-called páramos. People don't know this, but the páramos, there's no translation to English, but the páramos are only in the South American Andes. And we have 50% of those páramos. These are ecosystems that are factories of water. 70% of the rivers in Colombia come from the páramos, 70. And we have more rivers than the United States. We have more rivers than India. We have a lot of water, and water is getting scarce in the world. So that factor of bringing in the different representation of Colombia is a very diverse country. Bringing it into the negotiation was very important, with the criteria of everybody feeling represented in the agreement.
Thanks. Michelle, do we have time for one more question? So, yeah, let's have, the gentleman, yeah, with the white shirt. Thanks.
Thank you, President Santos. It's an honor to have you here. So, as you said, the peace process has been a long, hard road. What would you say was the biggest setback you encountered? A moment where you thought everything might fall apart, and how did you manage to, overcome that?
The biggest
Setback.
setback.
The biggest setback in the process, he's called Uribe. I'm just joking, I'm joking. Every peace process has critics, always. A peace process boils down to where you draw the line between peace and justice. And no matter where you draw that line, somebody would claim that they wanted more justice, or somebody will claim that they wanted more peace. So it's impossible to satisfy everybody. Maybe the biggest drawback is my fault, that I underestimated the political forces against the agreement. That's why I lost a referendum. I think that weakened the agreement. It's not true that I did not respect our democracy. On the contrary, I respected exactly what the Constitutional Court told me I had to do if I lost the referendum, and that's what I did. Renegotiate. I brought in the people who had made campaigns against the agreement, led by Uribe. I said, what is it that you want to change in the agreement? They identified 50 points, 5-0, and we were able to change and to adopt 48 of those 50 points. And then we submitted that to Congress. That's what we signed the 24th of November, and Congress, by an overwhelming majority, approved it, and then the Constitutional Court approved it. But politically, that was a big blow that weakened the agreement internally, not externally. It is, thank God, incredible how the international community has supported the agreement to the extent that in the history of the United Nations, the Security Council, since its creation after the Second World War, has never approved so many unanimous resolutions in favor of any event like with the Colombian process. So that has been extremely, extremely important. But I would say that was the biggest drawback.
President Santos, one more? Yeah, great. Okay, so yeah, here. Yeah, you?
Si quieren quedarse más tiempo, yo puedo quedar.
Oh, really? All right. Thank you, President Santos. My name is Rafael Alfonso. I'm a student of the MSFS, but I'm also part of the interim government of Venezuela. I'm a diplomat representative here in the embassy in Washington, D.C. President Santos, as a result of the peace agreement with the guerrillas in Colombia, which was reached despite its rejection by the majority of the Colombian people expressed through that referendum, we have seen members of the guerrilla who have committed crimes occupying seats in the Congress. A Congress of the Parliament is supposed to be the most direct representation of the people, which again rejected the peace agreement. In Venezuela today, we have a criminal state, criminals holding public office. We have seen the result of these in terms of the destruction of the democracy and the weakening of our institutions. Let's suppose that the transition in Venezuela takes place. Under the same scheme of your agreement, should crimes committed by these people go unpunished? Should this agreement even contemplate that these criminals may continue to hold public office, that they be granted representation in the Congress? Since when, President Santos, do criminals, instead of going to jail, assume seats in Congress? Thank you.
No le entendí mucho.
Un poco extrapolando el acuerdo de paz en Colombia, si en Venezuela, como parte de una transición,
If I understood you correctly, I know there's many people who criticize that the guerrillas are right now in Congress without going to jail. But that is part of the peace process, changing the weapons for the opportunity to do politics. It's always a hard transition. The people who criticize that, and they say that we're giving impunity to the guerrilla leaders, they're not correct. It's the first time that the guerrilla leaders will be judged and condemned by a court. Before, the guerrillas in Colombia were favored by an amnesty. They did not have to go to any court. They did not have to tell any truth. They were simply erased from the penal accusations. Venezuela, it's a different situation. But if you ask me what I would think would be a solution for Venezuela, I told this to President Trump some years ago. I've been telling this government also. If you negotiate a golden bridge for the regime, and that means giving them a dignified way out, and you bring in the real stakeholders. And who are the real stakeholders? Russia, China, and Cuba, with the US and the United Nations. A negotiation of this type is the way to restore democracy in Venezuela. If you think that by sanctions or by what my President Duque and Piñera tried some years ago, 3 years ago, they're wrong. Today, Maduro is stronger than he was 3 years ago. So you need, Venezuela is being destroyed slowly but surely. We all want, and Colombia more than any other country, because we have suffered by what is happening in Venezuela, a solution there. But it has to be a pragmatic, realistic solution. I don't know if these efforts that Norway is doing in Mexico will be successful. I think that you have to bring the stakeholders that can really force a situation, and I think the US must be much more proactive in that process in order to have a solution. But we have a problem here, which is unfortunate. The foreign policy of the United States right now is defined as the foreign policy for the middle class. Well, that means foreign policy that will generate votes. And with the political situation internally, every vote counts, as you have seen here in Virginia. And so, in a way, that has frozen the initiative of the United States. And for example, to bring Cuba into the solution would be to try to negotiate or get to an understanding with Cuba. But today, politically, that would be a sacrilege here, because then you will lose the votes of the Cuban and the many Latin votes in the next election. So we are in a catch-22 situation. Hopefully, you can come out of that, and I think the solution, I am quite sure the solution would be to negotiate a golden bridge, as in any peace process, and restore democracy in Venezuela.
Let's take one more. Maybe over there. You and yeah.
Hi, sir. My name is Caitlin Smith. I'm a part-time master's student in the Security Studies program here at Georgetown, and I am full-time on the Columbia desk at the State Department. So very happy to be with you here with you today. My question would be, how has the international community, you sort of touched on this, how has the international community best supported Colombia throughout the implementation of the peace accords, and how can we kind of build on lessons learned up till now to best support the new administration that will come in 2022? Thanks.
How is the international community
supporting the implementation of the peace process, and how can it support the new administration that will come in?
Like I tried to say at the beginning, one of the conditions for a successful peace process was to have the support of the region. But I would add to that the support of the international community. I think very few processes have had the unanimous support of the whole of the international community. And that has been extremely important. And they have supported not only political support during the process. For example, Obama appointed, and I'm very grateful to him for that, a special envoy. The European Union appointed a special envoy. Angela Merkel appointed a special envoy, and the United Nations, which at the beginning we were a bit apprehensive of bringing the United Nations in because we were of the idea that when the United Nations come in, they will never go out, has been extremely, extremely useful, because that has given the process a lot of strength and trust. How can they, and I would say that this difficult times from these 5 years since the signature of the agreement, they have had a lot of difficulties, and without the support of the international community, probably the people who wanted to derail the agreement would have succeeded. The international community has been, in a way, sort of a guarantor. And I hope that this will be the case in the future. There was a very important fact that, or happening some weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court went to Colombia and said Colombia had for many, many years an investigation in the International Criminal Court. And he said, I will suspend this investigation provided that we make an agreement. And he signed an agreement with President Duque, where that's why I say I'm very happy now that things have changed, where the president commits himself and the government and the state to continue to support the special justice system, continues to implement the points of the agreement that have not been implemented. He commits himself to give the resources in the budget for that to happen. So in a way, he said, there's an agreement that I am committing myself to implement. At that same day, in the United Nations, the Security Council extended for 1 more year the mandate of the presence of the United Nations. Those two factors were extremely positive. That's why I say that right now I'm very optimistic that this will continue, and the way that the international community can help is simply by continuing to support, especially the political support, but also if they can do some support in monetary figures, that is always welcomed.
Well, thank you, President Santos. Thank you for coming today and giving this impressive lecture on leadership strategy and obviously on the history of this historical peace agreement. But most of all, thank you for your leadership in the region. We definitely miss leaders like you with vision, courage, and a clear way forward. And as you said, when you learn from your Navy chief, a point of destination, and eventually getting there and delivering for your population. Thank you.